What you are watching unfold in the Persian Gulf is not an isolated military exchange. It is not a tit-for-tat skirmish between a regional power and the world's foremost military. What is happening right now, as Iranian ballistic missiles arc over Kuwait and U.S. strike packages penetrate Iranian airspace, is the visible surface of a much deeper structural crisis, one that has been building for years inside the architecture of American power projection in the Middle East, and one that exposes something far more uncomfortable than any single headline will admit. Let us be precise about what has occurred, because precision matters here in ways the mainstream commentary almost entirely ignores. The United States struck Iranian radar installations and command and control nodes on Keshem Island and in Gurich province. The stated justification was the shootdown of an American MQ-1 drone operating over what CENTCOM describes as international waters. The Iranians predictably contest that characterization, but the legal geography of the incident is almost irrelevant to the strategic reality it reveals. What matters is the sequence. An American surveillance drone was destroyed by Iranian air defense systems. The United States then conducted what it called measured and deliberate retaliatory strikes. Iran then launched ballistic missiles, not cruise missiles, not drones. Ballistic missiles at U.S. forces stationed in Kuwait. That word, ballistic, deserves to sit in your mind for a moment before we continue. The use of ballistic missiles against a U.S. military installation is not a routine escalation. It is a doctrinal statement. It tells you how Iran has assessed the cost-benefit calculus of direct confrontation. And what that assessment reveals is something Western strategic planners have spent decades avoiding: that the deterrent value of American conventional superiority in this theater has been progressively eroded not by any single Iranian capability, but by the cumulative effect of Iranian investment in systems specifically designed to challenge American force projection. Iran's ballistic missile arsenal is not a collection of Soviet-era relics. Over the past 2 decades, while American strategic attention oscillated between Afghanistan, Iraq, the pivot to the Pacific, and the management of European security, Iran developed and deployed short, medium, and intermediate-range ballistic missiles with improving accuracy, terminal maneuverability, and, critically, numbers sufficient to saturate point defense systems. The Fattah hypersonic glide vehicle, the Imad, the Ghadr series, the Sajil solid fuel systems, these are not propaganda props. They represent a coherent anti-access, area denial architecture built specifically around the vulnerabilities of American basing in the Gulf. When Kuwait's air defense systems activated to intercept incoming Iranian ballistic missiles, what the world was watching was not a success story. It was a stress test, and stress tests of layered air defense architectures reveal their seams. The Kuwaiti General Staff's public announcement during the attack, informing citizens that explosion sounds were from interception operations, tells you something important about the operational environment. Air defense interceptors consume finite magazines. THAAD batteries, Patriot PAC-3 systems, and shorter-range point defense weapons are not infinite resources. Each successful intercept represents a munition expended, a reload cycle initiated, a logistics chain activated. Iran knows this. The Iranian doctrine of simultaneous, saturating missile launches, what military analysts describe as a cost imposition strategy, is designed precisely to force the expenditure of interceptors faster than they can be resupplied, to probe the architecture's saturation point, and ultimately to identify corridors of reduced coverage. This is not speculation. It is what the Iranians have written about, trained for, and demonstrated. The launch footage released by the IRGC, multiple missiles in the air simultaneously, is not theatrical bravado. It is a visual communication of a specific operational approach. Now compound that reality with the parallel Iranian action against the UAE's Al Dhafra airbase. Iran reportedly struck aircraft hangars hosting Mirage 2000 fighters and Wing-Lung drones used in strikes against Iranian targets, including Bandar Abbas and the Lavon oil facility. This is a significant escalation in geometric terms. Iran is no longer simply responding to the immediate aggressor. It is striking the entire network of states whose military infrastructure has been used against Iranian territory. The UAE, which has positioned itself as a quiet but substantive military partner in the campaign of economic and now kinetic pressure on Iran, suddenly finds its most sensitive air assets directly targeted. What this means strategically is that Iran has communicated the following: any state that provides basing, aerial platforms, or targeting infrastructure for strikes on Iranian soil will be treated as a combatant. The distinction between principal and surrogate has collapsed in Iranian doctrine. That is not an irrational position. It is, in fact, the same logic NATO itself employs when it declares that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Iran has simply applied the same principle unilaterally to the Gulf security architecture. The Strait of Hormuz dimension cannot be overstated. IRGC footage of missile boats, small, fast, carrying 2 to 4 anti-ship missiles each, operating in the strait during this escalation is not coincidental. The Strait of Hormuz is the choke point through which approximately 20% of globally traded oil transits. Iranian small boat tactics in the strait are among the most studied and most feared scenarios in American naval planning, precisely because they are extremely difficult to neutralize cleanly. The physics are unfavorable for a defending surface combatant. Small, fast-moving boats operating in cluttered shallow water environments with land-based radar coverage, firing anti-ship missiles from close range, represent a targeting challenge that no amount of carrier strike group firepower fully resolves. The message being sent by activating those boats, even if they fire nothing, is that Iran retains the option to threaten the global oil supply as a strategic lever. That is not a trivial card to play. And it has not gone unnoticed that this is happening during what American officials describe as an ongoing ceasefire. That phrase, ongoing ceasefire, appearing in a CENTCOM statement describing its own military strikes, is itself a kind of strategic absurdity that deserves direct examination. The United States is conducting self-described self-defense strikes inside Iranian territory while simultaneously referring to an active ceasefire. Iran is launching ballistic missiles at U.S. military installations while the same ceasefire nominally exists. Both sides are framing their actions as responses to the other's aggression. Both sides are technically correct. What this tells you is that the ceasefire, whatever its formal structure, has not produced a stable deterrence equilibrium. It has produced a managed ambiguity in which both parties continue to operate kinetically, each defining its actions as reactive rather than initiative, while the underlying conflict continues to escalate. This is an extremely dangerous structural condition. It means there is no mutually understood red line. It means neither side has communicated a threshold beyond which escalation becomes uncontrollable in the other's assessment. It means the ladder of escalation is being climbed in the dark without a shared understanding of where the top rung is. And then there is the drone, the MQ-1 that initiated this latest cycle. Let us think carefully about what the drone's destruction represents in strategic terms, because it is not merely a hardware loss. The United States relies on persistent surveillance drones for the intelligence architecture that underlies its precision strike capability in this theater. Surveillance data feeds targeting packages. Targeting packages enable strikes. Strikes without accurate intelligence are degraded significantly in their effectiveness. When Iran destroys an American surveillance drone over the Gulf, it is not simply removing a platform from the order of battle. It is communicating that it possesses the air defense capability, the radar acquisition capability, and the engagement authority to deny American intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations in the theater. That is a fundamentally different message than downing a drone over a contested border in a fog of war incident. It is a deliberate operational decision to impose ISR denial on a major adversary. And the fact that Iran released footage of the engagement, framing it as a clean, deliberate interception, suggests this was not accidental. It was a demonstration. The American response, strikes on the radar and command nodes that enabled that interception, was predictable. and Iran likely anticipated it. Which raises the uncomfortable question, was the drone engagement by Iran calculated to produce exactly the American response that subsequently occurred, in order to justify the ballistic missile salvo that followed? Strategic deception and provocation sequencing are not novel concepts in this theater. Iran has demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how to generate justifications for escalatory actions while maintaining the appearance of reactivity. That is not a condemnation. It is an accurate description of how states operating under significant power asymmetries manage their escalation options. The targeted assassination report, the alleged strike on Wahid Haqqan in Tehran province, followed by what appears to have been a gas explosion in the same location, adds another layer of complexity to an already dense operational picture. Targeted killings of senior Iranian figures have been conducted in this theater before, with varying degrees of attribution and Iranian response. The pattern is consistent. An intelligence-driven strike is followed by an ambiguous or denied incident that may mask the kill's success or failure, followed by Iranian escalation that may or may not be directly linked to the assassination attempt. What is significant here is the timing. A targeted killing attempt, a ballistic missile barrage, drone destruction footage, air-based strikes across multiple Gulf states, all occurring within the same operational window. This is not a sequence of independent incidents. It is a multi-domain, simultaneous pressure campaign. Whether coordinated or coincidental in its timing, the cumulative effect is to deny any single adversary the ability to isolate and respond to one thread without the others continuing to develop. Now consider the geopolitical architecture surrounding all of this. Iran's statement that if aggression is repeated, the response will be completely different is a calibrated escalation warning. The phrase completely different in Iranian strategic communication typically signals a willingness to move from targeted military responses to broader infrastructure, economic, or maritime actions. It may reference the Strait closure option. It may reference strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure. It may reference activation of proxy networks across the region in a simultaneous multi-front operation. The ambiguity is deliberate. Ambiguous threats require the adversary to hedge against all possibilities simultaneously, which is strategically expensive. The Trump administration's public statement, noting Iranian desire for a deal while criticizing domestic political opponents for interfering with negotiating space, reveals something important about the American strategic posture in this moment. The administration is attempting to hold open a diplomatic channel while simultaneously conducting military operations inside Iranian territory. That is not inherently contradictory. Coercive diplomacy has a long history, but it requires the adversary to believe that the military pressure is genuinely connected to achievable negotiating outcomes, rather than simply escalatory momentum without an off-ramp. Whether Iran assesses that an off-ramp exists, and whether it believes the American administration has the domestic political coherence to execute a deal, is the central variable determining where this goes next. And that variable is deeply uncertain. What the broader international community is watching is something that matters far beyond the Gulf. This is a live test of American extended deterrence in a theater where that deterrence has been progressively contested over the past decade. If Iran can launch ballistic missiles at US military installations and sustain its operational capacity, its missile inventory, its air defense architecture, its naval presence in the Strait, its proxy networks, then the credibility of American deterrence as a restraining force on regional state behavior will have been visibly degraded. Not destroyed, but degraded. That degradation has compounding effects. States throughout the Indo-Pacific, in South Asia, across the post-Soviet periphery, every government that makes strategic calculations based on American security guarantees watches this theater and draws conclusions. The conclusions they draw about American willingness and ability to impose unacceptable costs on adversaries who directly attack American military installations will shape their own strategic decisions for years. This is why the Iranian missile launch matters beyond Kuwait. It is a data point in a global data set that every American adversary is continuously updating. There is one more dimension that receives almost no analytical attention in public discourse: the munitions economics of this conflict. Every interceptor fired by Kuwaiti air defenses over the Gulf is a Patriot PAC-3 or equivalent class missile that costs between $3 and $4 million per round. Every Iranian ballistic missile fired costs a fraction of that to produce at scale within Iran's domestic defense industrial base. The cost exchange ratio, the ratio between what it costs to defend against an attack and what it costs to conduct one, is asymmetric in Iran's favor in this scenario. Iran can launch missiles that cost several $100,000 and force the expenditure of interceptors costing 3 to 4 times as much to stop them. At scale, over a sustained period of conflict, this asymmetry has serious implications for the sustainability of U.S. allied air defense coverage in the Gulf. Magazine depth is not unlimited. Production rates for advanced interceptors are not easily accelerated. The American defense industrial base has been operating at reduced production rates for high-end interceptors for years, a reality that the Ukraine conflict has already begun to expose in the context of European air defense. The same constraints apply in the Gulf. Iran's strategic planners understand this. The ballistic missile campaign is not just a military action. It is an economic warfare instrument, imposing costs on adversaries whose defense expenditures are politically constrained and whose industrial production rates cannot easily keep pace with missile consumption in a sustained engagement. What comes next is genuinely difficult to predict, and anyone who tells you otherwise is confusing confidence for analysis. The variables are whether American strikes on Iranian territory produce sufficient deterrent effect to halt further Iranian escalation, whether the diplomatic channel remains open, and whether both sides have credible interlocutors capable of communicating red lines, whether Iranian proxy networks, Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, Houthi remnants, activate in coordination with the direct Iranian action, whether any incident produces mass casualties among American service members, which would likely trigger a qualitatively different American response, and whether the Strait of Hormuz remains open, because the moment it does not, you are in a different conflict entirely, one with direct implications for global energy markets, Asian import economies, and European recession risk. Each of these variables is in motion simultaneously. None is fully under any single actor's control. The ceasefire that both sides nominally claim to respect is at this point a legal fiction overlaid on an active military exchange. The gap between what is publicly acknowledged and what is operationally occurring has rarely been wider in this theater. The public narrative, Iran bad, America responding, air defenses working, situation tense but manageable, is not false in its individual components, but it is profoundly inadequate as a strategic description of what is actually happening. The structural realities, the missile economics, the ISR denial, the basing vulnerability, the escalation ambiguity, the industrial capacity constraints, the multi-domain simultaneity of Iranian operations, the erosion of deterrence credibility. These are the things that determine whether this resolves into a negotiated de-escalation or continues spiraling toward a conflict neither side has fully wargamed at the level of intensity now approaching. The situation is more serious than it is being presented. The escalation is less controllable than official statements suggest, and the strategic questions being raised by what is happening right now in the skies over Kuwait and the corridors of the Strait of Hormuz will not be resolved by press releases, by social media statements, or by the comfortable assumption that both sides will eventually find an off-ramp. They may. States have managed back from the edge of serious confrontation before, but they have done so by understanding with clarity what they were actually dealing with. Not the surface narrative, but the structural realities underneath it. Whether the decision makers in Washington and Tehran possess that clarity right now is the most important unknown in the most consequential ongoing military situation on the planet. Watch carefully. Think slowly. The headlines will not tell you what you need to know.